Hello. Should I say hello? Lori Ann here at Sun State Academy, getting ready to teach for Cohort B, Part 2 of arm and shoulder, specifically forearm and hand. Gonna wait about 5 minutes or so till about 5 after to officially start the lecture, but welcome as you pop in, say hello to me. And we'll get started in about 5 minutes to see if anybody else pops on today. Hello.
Hello.
Gonna wait till about 5 after and we'll get started. It's probably gonna just be us. I think some of the students have been watching these online instead.
Oh, okay.
I always like to give it a few extra minutes just in case before we get started and wrap up the arm and shoulders. And hopefully maybe I'm in a different room, so maybe you can see the board a little bit easier this time around than last time. If not, I make sure I spell everything out for you as best I can. As usual, holler and let me know if you need me to respell anything or say anything or repeat myself or anything like that.
Okay, will do.
Did you have any questions at all from last week's lecture? Or anything when you went through your notes that you needed me to maybe explain again? Or were we good with everything that we did?
I think we were good with everything that we did. Thank you.
Okay,
I
great.
actually finished up the massage program and I'm doing makeup hours for
okay.
These lectures.
Great.
So yeah.
So you know
It's
what
good
we're
review
doing
for
now.
me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, about another minute and we'll go ahead and get started. I don't know if Adrian's hopping on with us today or not. He said he was going to try, but he's been watching them in the evening, so we'll see. All right, well, I have to sit down or I lose half my head with this new kind of setup I have going on. So probably getting up and down quite a bit, back and forth between the board, but let's go ahead and get started. On Tuesday, we started the arm and shoulder section of the trail guide and we did the bones, landmarks, and muscles of the shoulder arm. Today, we're moving on to the forearm and hand. I took Mr. Bones apart so we could have a little bit of something to talk with this time. Unfortunately, there aren't the slides like when I screen share for the arm and shoulder. For the forearm and hand, those trail guide slides, I don't know where they are. So I will jump back and forth with the diagrams between that and just me lecturing from the book. We will be starting out on page 108. And again, just like with the other section, it's just a good view to have, that topographical view, because it gives you an idea when you're looking at a client flesh and bone. You don't have the benefit of seeing all the muscles and everything underneath to kind of get a visual of where the metacarpal phalangeal joints are, where the extensor digitorum muscles, brachioradialis, all of those kind of things, thenar eminence, that mound of flesh here at the base of our thumb, just different things like that. So that's always a good view to refer back to, so that when you're working on a client, you have an idea of where some of the different landmarks and things are. Especially if you look at the bottom diagram, you can see a little bit better of that medial epicondyle of the humerus on the bone. And when you look at the side view, you can see that olecranon process of the ulna, that bony part. We learned on the humerus about that fossa that it goes down into when the arm is straight. So you can see here, as I took him apart, when it is bent, we see that bony part of the elbow, but it kind of lays down into that fossa nice and smoothly. When the arm is straight, it doesn't stick out quite as bony. We'll be exploring the radius and ulna and all of the carpals and metacarpals and some of the muscles. We don't have a lot of muscles that we're going to go over of the forearm as far as the test goes, but there are a lot of them that I recommend studying outside of this lecture for when you do your massage prep and your MBLEX. So especially when we talk about some of the movements, I'll kind of show you how rotation occurs between the joint of the ulna and radius when we get to that part as well. So we're going to switch over to page 110 and 111 of the trail guide to kind of go over the bones there. And this is going to somewhat mirror our handouts. I'm going to go ahead and screen share the handout for filling in the diagrams. I want this one. All right. So we're kind of looking at it in a sideways view here. But as you can see, this is kind of an overview. We have our carpals, and we'll break those down even further individually, and I have a good mnemonic to help you remember those. Then we have the metacarpals, which are long bones, and the phalanges, which are long bones as well. We have our radius and our ulna. And I like to give my students ways to help them remember radius and ulna, etc. is when we're in anatomic position, palms forward, is that the radius is rad. So our radius is on our thumb side, right? The radius is rad, anatomic position, palms always forward. And I like to remember my ulna. My Aunt Ulna drinks her tea with her pinky finger sticking out, the ulna on that pinky side. So that's an easy way to always remember rad, radius, and ulna. When you're looking at them, if you don't have a reference point of a thumb or a thumb or a pinky finger, I also like to note that that ulna is the longest bone here. It's the one that actually articulates with that humerus. So I always say the radius is the ulna's shorty. He's a shorty right here. So it actually, radius actually articulates with the ulna, not up here with the humerus. So the radius is the shorty to the ulna. And the other thing to keep in mind too is some of my students, I notice when we start talking anatomic position and they start to label things like medial and lateral, epicondyles and things like that is to remember, if you're in anatomic position facing forward with those palms forward, if you go to look at the posterior view, you have to flip your whole body around. You cannot just flip the arm, because what happens when you just flip the arm is you've just flip-flopped your medial and lateral sides, and then you're going to get everything backwards. So you have to think in that supine and prone position, that anatomic position, when it comes to labeling things and or learning things like medial and lateral epicondyles and all those little parts. Remembering, don't just flip-flop the arm, think about flipping that whole body over from supine to prone position. All right, I'm going to go back in to sharing again with my diagrams. So there you can see we have the radius on the thumb side and the ulna on the pinky side. And we're going to come down a little bit further now, and we're going to actually look at ulna and radius here. So remember, our ulna is our tall bone that articulates with the humerus. It is the longer bone, and the radius is its shorter. So when we look at the diagram, we see the head of the radius is number 6. And then we have the radial tuberosity. And then just remember that tuberosity is a middle-sized bump, tubercle being the small, tuberosity, and it's usually a little rougher in texture. It gives a little bit more of an attachment site. It's got a little bit more texture to it for those muscles to attach to. You come down to number 8, it is the styloid process of the radius. And if you remember right, a process is a finger-like projection. And a lot of time you can pick up a bone from that process. I'm going to stop screen share again. I want to actually show you those on our little arm here. So stop share. You can actually see, if we're looking at it in anatomic position, I'm going to flip it around, the styloid process here. You can see that actual little process sticking out both here and here. So those are the styloid processes. And if you have it in anatomic position, then we know this is the styloid process of the radius here on the thumb side. And then this is the styloid process of the ulna here on the pinky side. So go back to my diagrams. All right, so you see the styloid process of the radius is 8. Number 12 is styloid process of the ulna. I know I'm skipping around. I kind of like to go in a pattern that makes sense. And it's pointing to both because we're looking at both anterior and posterior view. When you come up to number 9, you have the trochlear notch. And then you're going to see a coronoid process for number 10. And again, a process is a finger-like projection. Coronoid and coracoid mean like a beak. So you have a coronoid process. And just like I mentioned on the scapula, coronoid and coracoid mean the same thing. I have little tricks to help me remember most of them. Coracoid on the scapula, I think about the hard C, and I remember coronoid on the ulna. That's how I remember that that one is a coronoid process and not a coracoid process. Coronoid process on our ulna. We talked about the shaft of the ulna. When we come over there, we have that olecranon process. And then we have the head of the radius, and then the shaft of the radius. And then we have Lister's tubercle. So a tubercle, small bump, and it's just above that styloid process of the radius. And I kind of have a little way that I remember these. I remember the stylish sisters. The stylish sisters of the radius and ulna have their creepy uncle Lister. And an uncle is older or above the sisters. So that's how I remember Lister's tubercle, right up there above that styloid process of the radius. Lister's tubercle. All right. So that is an overview of the bones of the hand and forearm. We're going to get into the carpals and metacarpals. If you look on page 111 of your book, you're going to see a breakdown of those carpals there. There are 8 carpals, and I like to divide them up. We're looking at a palm view. And they've got the reverse view there in the book. I want to look at the palmar view, like our diagram, and show you that really quickly. All right, so we're looking at the palmar view of the right wrist, and we have the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetrum, the pisiform, and then we have the scaphoid tubercle, which is a bump on the scaphoid. We have the trapezium tubercle, which is a bump on the trapezium. Trapezoid, you can see it has that trapezoid shape. The capitate, which I nicknamed the capitato because it looks like a big old baking potato. Then we have the hook of the hamate. We learned on Tuesday, also known as a hamulus, that hook or projection is. And then we have the hamate. So I have a great little mnemonic. A lot of teachers use this mnemonic to help you remember the bones, the carpals of the hand when we're in this palmar view. And I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. Did I lose my meeting? Can you still see me? I don't know quite what happened here.
I can see you, but it's stuck on the screen share.
It is stuck on the screen share. Why did it go away from the screen share on me? It kind of did a freaky thing. There we go. All right, now you can see me, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what happened. These little tablets sometimes do weird things. All right, so granted, they're not perfect squares, but one of the easiest ways to remember it is there are 8 of them. We're looking at that palmar view. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Scared lovers try positions that they can't handle. So I'll write that one down. I'm going to write on this side. Scared lovers try positions that they can't handle. Hopefully you can see all the way down the board in the direction I'm going. So we have on our board then, we have our scaphoid, our lunate, our triquetrum, our pisiform, and I remember there are 3 T's in here, but I remember in the mnemonic scared lovers try, the word try is the triquetrum. Pisiform, pisiform, I don't care how you say it as long as you get it right. That, we're coming down here to the next row of 4. That is the trapezium. Then we have our actual trapezoid, which is more of a true trapezoid shape. Capitate, which is the one I say looks like a big potato, and then the hamate. So if that one works for you, I've also heard the mnemonic, scared losers try pot that they can't handle. It's up to you which mnemonic you want to do, just as long as you remember the order that they go in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, of course, when you look at the opposite view, then you're just going the backwards. Scared lovers try positions that they can't handle. So for the sake of our diagram, which I'm going to pull back up, you just have to pay attention to where those arrows are going to notice whether or not it's pointing at the actual bone or it's pointing at the bump on the bone. So if you go in on any diagram like this and you label the bones first, then you can go back in and add the tubercle, scaphoid tubercle, trapezium tubercle, and hook of the hamate as well. All right, so now we're going to flip from thumb pinky side to the dorsal view. Remember, we don't just flip our arm because then we mess up our medial. And there is our acronym again, scared lovers try positions that they can't handle. And so number 14, and it looks a little bit different in this dorsal view. You can see that that pisiform is little tiny, kind of almost off to the side and on top of that triquetrum. So we have number, I want to go 11. Let's start with 12. So we have our lunate, our scaphoid. We have our pisiform, our triquetrum. So they're numbered out of order. If you go in and you just remember that it's SLTP, then you don't have to worry. Like sometimes I'll even write on the diagram the letters of it in order and then go back and look at the numbers are going to try to throw you off by pointing out of order, right? You can't just go in numerical order. You have to actually look at the bone and remember the mnemonic and the names of them in the order that they lie and not numerically. So we have triquetrum, hamate, capitate, trapezoid, and trapezium. And in that view, we cannot really see the hook of the hamate. And I'm going to stop screen sharing that. So if you look, this is a right hand. So we're looking in our palmar view, and let's see if I can get it close enough. You can see then where you have those same, I'm going to drape him over my shoulder so I don't drop him. You can actually see the hook. I don't know if you can see that hook of the hamate right there sticking up. Actual little bony spot. And you can almost kind of feel that if you come right into that area on your wrist, kind of feel that hook of the hamate. But you can see you have that palmar view there of the right hand of those carpals. And then that dorsal view. You can see them kind of in there. And that little pisiform there sticking out. It looks like it's fused for the sake of not falling off on our little bony guy here. So those are the diagrams for the exam. I want to get into the book a little bit further, and I want to give some highlights there. And I also want to talk about some of the movements as well. We had all of our movements of the arm and shoulder. We had flexion of the shoulder. We had extension of the shoulder. We had abduction, adduction. We had horizontal adduction and abduction. We had elevation and depression. We had adduction of the scapula, where medial border of scapula comes closer to spinous process. Abduction, bringing them away and forward. And rotation. So now we're getting into the muscles that cross the elbow joint, the wrist joint, and all of the fingers. So we're going to have a lot of movement in that place, but we're also adding on some supination and some pronation to our abduction, adduction, and flexion, extension, etc. So I like to come over to page page. Where are my movements? Let's start on page 127, muscles of the forearm. You're going to see an overview of the muscles of the forearm in your book. And unfortunately, I don't have those slides like I wish I did. We don't have any diagrams for this exam, but it would be helpful to like create your own diagram if you have the ability or some flashcards of these muscles. You can see kind of grayed out at the top where biceps brachii comes down from that top of the arm. And you can see we have pronator teres, we have flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris, we have our flexor digitorum superficialis, our antebrachial fascia, our palmar aponeurosis. Remember, aponeurosis is a flat tendinous sheath, so those are tendons coming down. Our pollicis, remember pollicis is thumb, you thumbs up at the poll, you voted, whatever. Brachioradialis, bicipital aponeurosis, we learned a little bit about that on Tuesday as well, and brachialis in there as well. And the one thing that I want you to highlight on this page is letter C. Muscles that create pivoting action between the radius and ulna are the pronator teres, pronator quadratus, and supinator. And those aren't necessarily on here, but I want you to know those muscles and they'll be in the actions again. And if you look at the arm, we don't get that rotation from the actual elbow itself. Rotation comes, shoulder rotation is different than pronation and supination. So elbow in a fixed position, pronation and supination is gonna happen because the ulna articulates with your humerus, but the radius right here articulates with your ulna, not up here. So with elbow fixed, you can see that pronation and supination that happens. Supination, face up, pronation down. So we lay supine in anatomic position, palms up. An easy way, supine, if you say supine, an easy way to remember that is in supination, I'm carrying a bowl of soup. I pronate, I've poured my soup out. Supination, pronation, rotating it up, supination, rotating it down, pronation. That made my hand look really big. It's not the best camera angle I've chosen ever today, but I'm closer to the board for you guys. That's what matters. All right, so I want you to flip over to page 130 of your book. And I want you to look now where we can actually look at all those movements that take place. So for the elbow, we have flexion and extension. And under flexion, I want you to just go ahead and highlight those muscles that biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis are your prime movers of flexion. And then you have a list that assist. Your carpi radialis, ulnaris, palmaris longus, pronator teres. Again, your flexors and your carpi radialis and ulnaris. And then your extensor, carpi radialis longus, and brevis as well. That's a good group of muscles to know for flexion of the elbow. And then for extension, our primary extender is the triceps brachii. Remember, we only have that one muscle on the posterior side of our arm that's going to come down to bring it into that extended position. So flexion of the elbow, extension of the elbow, flexion, extension. For our forearm, I talked about pronation and supination, and you can see there, supination is biceps brachii, supinator, and brachioradialis is an assister, and pronation is pronator teres, pronator quadratus, and our brachioradialis assists on both. And you can kind of see the direction that those fibers go. Then in our wrist, we have extension and flexion. So again, an anatomic position. Muscles on the front of the body flex and muscles on the back of the body extend, except for our knees and toes are on backwards. So flexion, extension, flexion, extension. If we are in anatomic position, same thing here. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. And I was thinking I do have a right hand. Never mind. Thought for some reason I had a lefty for a second. So we have extension and flexion at the wrist. We also have abduction and adduction of the wrist. And this is another place that I see students sometimes confuse themselves. They think of it as waving, and they're like abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, but they get it backwards when they bring their hand up into this position. Remember, it's got to be down in anatomic position, abduction, adduction. So going out towards the thumb side and away. So if you brought your hand overhead, it would be backwards, abduction, adduction. So make sure you're in anatomic position when you're trying to go through and figure out your movements. So it's kind of like that wave, you're abducting and adducting. And then we have our hands and our fingers. So we have extension and flexion in anatomic position. Again, muscles on the front. I'm gonna bring my hand out to the side. Flex, extend, flex, extend. So our thumb is separate in the positions that, in the movements that it does. We have abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction of the hand and fingers. Now our thumb is different. Flexion and extension come in and out this way. And we have our opposition. And then we also have abduction and adduction, which goes in the opposite direction as well. And I don't know if they really show that one in here of the thumb. They don't really, they just kind of cover flexion and extension. So flexion and extension, extending it out for the movements of the hand. Any questions on that? We good?
All good.
All right. So now jumping into the actual muscles, and this is going to be kind of a quick lecture today, I guess, because there aren't very many highlights. I'd like to change this test. I'm sure the students are happy that all these forearm muscles aren't in there. I would love for us to have a diagram of all these muscles. As massage therapists, our extensors and our flexors are always tight and sore. If somebody sits at a computer a lot, we really should be focusing a lot on massaging those areas, not kind of just glossing over them, and learning about the directions of the fibers, pronation, supination, how to help release the carpals if somebody has some carpal tunnel going on. But for our highlights, there's not too many, but we'll kind of jump through these muscles anyways. On page 132, we're going to start with the brachialis, which is considered a muscle of the upper arm, but its movements happen in the elbow. So when we categorize it for movements and everything, it is part of the forearm and hand group. So the brachialis is a strong elbow flexor that lies deep to the biceps brachii on the anterior arm. I want you to highlight that. Stop highlighting. It has a flat yet thick belly. Ironically, however, the brachialis girth only helps the biceps to bulge further from the arm, making brachialis the biceps' best friend. Although it lies underneath the biceps, portions of the brachialis are accessible and its lateral edge, so that thumb side, if we're in anatomic position, sandwiched between the biceps and triceps brachii, is superficial and palpable. So we're coming out right around kind of this outside edge area, and actually can be quite tender. You have to be careful when you're massaging around biceps. Like triceps can handle some more, but you've got, when you come right around deltoid tuberosity, etc., can be quite tender. The distal aspect of brachialis is also accessible as it passes along either side of the biceps tendon, right down in this area. So highlight that the action is that it flexes the elbow at that humero-ulnar joint that we talked about. Humerus and ulna coming together here. Radius does not articulate up here. It articulates down here with our little ulna. pinky side. Its origin is the distal half of the anterior surface of the humerus, and its insertion is tuberosity and coronoid process of the ulna. So if you were to look back at the bone of the ulna, you would see where that coronoid process is again, or you can look at your diagram to see where it comes down to. That coronoid process is the proximal part of the bone, just below the trochlear notch. And when do we use our brachialis? Bringing food from the plate to our mouth, picking up a load of anatomy books, and carrying a baby car seat. So we are going now over to a brachioradialis. I'm going to move this down so I can see it a little bit better. All right, so our brachioradialis is superficial on the lateral side of the forearm. I want you to highlight that. It has a long oval belly which forms and I want you to highlight this, a helpful dividing line between the flexors and extensors of the wrist and fingers. This is an important highlight. Put a little asterisk next to it if you need to. The brachioradialis is a good, helpful dividing line between our flexors and our extensors. So it is superficial on the lateral side. So that means lateral, thumb side, right? That means right in this area, brachioradialis divides our flexors and our extensors right down that area, right here. And then it starts our extensors. And if you bring your hand on from lateral and just go around posterior and you start to bring the wrist into flexion, you can feel right up in this area some of that muscle contraction happening. So it flexes the elbow at the humeroulnar joint. Highlight that, please. It assists to pronate and supinate the forearm when these movements are resisted. So it is a resisted muscle. So it's not the one responsible for free movement, but resisted movement. It helps that rotation. So if you try to hold your hand and rotate, you can feel that brachioradialis give you a little contraction there under your fingertips when you're trying to palpate it. Its origin is the proximal 2/3 of the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus and styloid process of the ulna. I want to make sure that you highlighted those actions, both flexion of the elbow and assist to pronate and supinate the forearm. And I want to make sure that you know that that insertion is the styloid process of the radius, which is right down here. Your thumb side, radial is rad, styloid process right here. That is its insertion point. All right, when do we use it? Turning a door handle or screwdriver. So pronation and supination, right? Bringing a beer stein up to your mouth or a glass of wine. Whisking cream in a bowl and hoisting a toddler out of her crib. What if you have a boy? Out of his crib too? All right, so going over then, and it talks about distinguishing between the flexor and extensor group, and this is under palpation, and I don't have any highlights in this section for you, but I just want you to kind of take a little read over that area. It talks about how you can shake hands with your partner, then you can do some pronation and supination, and you can kind of feel the change when they flex the wrist and they rotate the wrist. You can feel the muscles on the different side, the flexors and the extensors, kind of do the movement. And you can see kind of where the hand is resting on either side when those movements are happening. Somebody has an arm that is the right size for you. You can feel extensors and flexors on both the extension and the flexion. You can wrap those fingers all the way around. So now we're going to jump into the extensors of the wrist and fingers. So we're down from the elbow now to wrist and fingers on page 135. And I just want you to note and highlight the muscles that do that extension of wrist and fingers. It's the extensor carpi radialis. You can say carpi. I know it's supposed to be carpi. I always say carpi. Extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, and extensor digitorum. I want you to highlight those 4 muscles, and you can look in that diagram how they come down and they come out onto those tendinous sheaths down onto the fingers there for that movement to take place. Extensor digitorum, of course, coming down to the digits there. And you can see carpi ulnaris and radialis. So ulnaris obviously is going to be on the pinky side, remember, and the radialis brevis and longus will be on that radial side, that thumb side, and longus, of course, being a longer muscle than our brevis muscle. You can see how that longus comes up and around. The 4 extensors create extension primarily at the wrist and fingers. They are situated between the brachioradialis and the shaft of the ulna along the forearm's lateral posterior surface. So lateral and posterior, right around here, this lateral side. And again, bringing the fingers here, bring it into extension, and you can actually feel those extensors do their job, and you can even feel them where they come down, the digitorum especially. And if somebody, you can actually sometimes, especially in massage therapists, you can actually see the muscle jump because we usually have fairly well-defined forearms. There's not a lot more that I want you to highlight about them on page 135, but the extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis are lateral posterior to the brachioradialis. Extensor carpi ulnaris, as its name suggests, lies beside the ulnar shaft, as we talked about, that pinky side, right? Which is going to be more medial and anatomic position. The extensor digitorum digiti minimi is sometimes classified as a separate muscle, but in reality, it is just the most medial portion of our extensor digitorum with a tendon attaching to the 5th finger. That is not an exam highlight, but that is an MBLEX-worthy highlight. I don't know if you do different colored highlights in your books. I have lots of highlights and notes depending on where I've found important tidbits, but the fact that sometimes it is given its own muscle name instead of just being a portion of that extensor digitorum. All right, we're going over to page 136, extensor carpi radialis, longus, and brevis. I want you to highlight the action. It extends the wrist and it abducts the wrist, abducts away, right? So extensor carpi radialis, longus, and brevis extend, extension, and abduct the wrist. They also assist flexion of the elbow and the humero-ulnar joint, but I want you to really make sure you know those first 2 actions. The longest originates in the distal 1/3 of the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus. And that's why it assists to flex the elbow, right? Because it's crossing the elbow joint as well. And we learned that when a muscle crosses the joint, it's assisting in the movement of that joint. The brevis, common extensor tendon from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus as well. And insertion, base of 2nd metacarpal, brevis is 3rd metacarpal. So we've got our 2nd and 3rd metacarpals. And I don't think you really need to worry about the nerves that innervate these specific muscles here right now. It doesn't hurt to study radial nerves, right? And knowing the radial nerves that come down, especially if you ever try to, you have somebody who has tingling in the last 3 fingers, like we know a good bit of the time, somebody has tingling in the arm in the first 3 fingers. Most of the time it's some kind of thoracic outlet syndrome, can be the brachial plexus under pectoralis minor or coming up through traps here, or maybe where it passes through the anterior and middle scalenes and down. But most of the time, if it's these 3 fingers here, it's from the ulnar side. And I'm trying to see if it even mentions here any of the ones that are for the ulnar nerve. It's common a lot, especially if somebody has tennis elbow. I'm trying to find it. Okay, well, it's in here somewhere. But if somebody's experiencing a lot of tingling just in these outside 3 fingers, you want to do a lot of work in and around the elbow, both proximal and distal, to any of those muscles that could be causing some kind of impingement. Tennis elbow is really common now, you guys. It used to be just somebody who played tennis or did a lot of that bending movement. But in this day and age, more and more numbers of especially younger people coming in, because we tend to sit in a bent elbow position, texting, swiping, reading on my iPad. I know if I'm on vacation and I'm doing a lot of reading and I am in bed in that bent position reading, I will start to get a little bit of that tightness, that tennis elbow, causing some of that aching in extensors and flexors, because they're staying in that shortened position instead of that nice extended out position. All right, so extensor carpi ulnaris is on page 136. I want you to highlight and know that these actions are: it extends the wrist at the radiocarpal joint, and it adducts the wrist. So coming towards the pinky side, adduction of the wrist. Adducts the wrist. Its origin is the common extensor tendon from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and its insertion is the base of the 5th metacarpal. And then we have extensor digitorum, and there's no highlights here, but its actions: it extends the 2nd through 5th fingers. Metacarpal phalangeal and interphalangeal joints is where that takes place, and it assists to extend the wrist. Its origin: common extensor tendon from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and its insertion: bases of middle and distal phalanges of 2nd through 5th fingers. Any questions? We're doing good, right? I'm kind of booking right along here. And you can kind of see the palpation of the extensor group. And it's something that I really, forearm is easy to palpate on ourselves. And I always tell my students, especially when they're new, if they tend to want to sprinkle fairy dust on somebody versus really getting that good firm pressure, is that the forearm is a very easy place to really determine the amount of pressure on self. So if you're coming along very gently on the forearm, but you can really grab and release and do some jostling of those muscles to loosen them up, then you know you can do that on a client too, right? You can really apply a lot of pressure. You just have to be careful when you get to where the bone is superficial, and kind of learning that anatomy. It's a really nice area to palpate on self. Kind of start to find where those muscle fibers, you can usually really feel the muscle fibers. It's also one of my favorite areas to demonstrate some lymphatic massage, because it's an area where you can fairly quickly feel that lymph start to become more fluid and move for you. So forearm area is a great place to do some self-palpation, check some pressure, and also explore the fibers of the muscles, the directions that they run. All right, we're going to flip over now to page 139 to the anconeus. Page 139. You can see in that diagram your olecranon process and the lateral epicondyle. That will give you an idea of what we're talking about, lateral thumb side. So it's coming over and into that olecranon process, just below the olecranon process of the ulna. So the anconeus is a weak elbow extensor located lateral to the olecranon process. I want you to highlight that. The anconeus is a weak elbow extensor located lateral to the olecranon process. It is triangular shaped, as you can see. It originates at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and fans out to attach on the shaft of the ulna. The anconeus is superficial, yet can be difficult to differentiate from the surrounding extensors. Because it is a weak muscle, usually you're going to be feeling the muscles, the other extensors around it, and not the anconeus. It's kind of really difficult to isolate a muscle contraction just for that muscle and not be feeling the stronger extensors around it. Its action, highlighted, extends the elbow at that humero-ulnar joint. That's such a hard word for me. I don't know why. Where the humerus and the ulnar articulate. Its origin is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and its insertion is the olecranon process and posterior proximal surface of the ulna. So you have the olecranon process. It starts right at that top and runs down as it fans out into that triangular shape. And you can kind of see in that diagram, if you're kind of coming into this area, where it would be, but it's kind of just, can't really get it to give you any movement like you would like. It's kind of hard to isolate it. We're going down now to extensor indices and a lot of people pronounce that C with a hard K. Being in editing and proofreading and knowing what an indices is for so long, I kind of call it that instead of an indicus. I'll call it an indicus for you guys. Extensor indicus. Located deep to the extensor digitorum and extensor carpi ulnaris, the small but crucial muscle, I want you to highlight that. I said there were no highlights, but small but crucial muscle assists the digitorum in specifically extending the index finger right here. So flexion, extension, right? It assists the digitorum in specifically extending the index finger. Its tendon runs down diagonally across the wrist and hand. You can see it comes at that angle. Is sheathed with the extensor digitorum tendon. If you extend your index finger at the metacarpal phalangeal joint, you might see two side-by-side tendons passing across the top of the knuckle. So if you do that movement, you can see, can you see both tendons there across the knuckle? In extension, especially when it comes back up. Let's see if I can get enough light in there. You can kind of see both of them right in that position. The medial tendon closer to the middle finger is the extensor indicus tendon. Its action extends the second finger, adducts the second finger, and may assist to extend the wrist. Its origin, posterior surface of distal shaft of ulna and interosseous membrane. So I don't know if we explore that in any of our diagrams. We don't really, and I usually have that page folded. It's further up. I've had students ask me before, so I'm gonna backtrack a second and find that membrane for you, so you can actually see what it is. It's kind of a webbing between ulna and radius. I just want to find that page for you. I usually have it dog-eared. My co-teachers freak out when I dog-ear my book, but it helps me teach so much better. Maybe it's a little further back, then I'm not finding it. Maybe it's further in. I know we show it in a diagram somewhere in the book. Apparently just not in this part. All right, so I'll see if I can find it, the interosseous membrane. Eventually, maybe I'll find it as I'm flipping through here and we're finishing up these muscles. And its insertion is the tendon of the extensor digitorum at the level of the second metacarpal. So the level of the second metacarpal, remember our right around second metacarpal there. All right, so moving over to page 140 in your trail guide, flexors of the wrist and hand. And we highlighted it in the front where the actual, all the actions and movements are. But I want you to highlight these muscles responsible for flexion of the wrist and fingers. So we're highlighting the flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor digitorum superficialis, and flexor digitorum profundus. It's a mouthful of words right there, isn't it? So the 5 flexors included in this section create flexion primarily at the wrist and fingers. So waving, waving, depending on how you want your wave to be, maybe shaking off a bee. They are located on the forearm's anterior medial surface, forearm, anterior medial. So in our anatomic position, palms forward, anterior, medial towards the inside part closest to midline of the body. Between the brachioradialis and the ulnar shaft. Most of the flexors originated as one mass from the common flexor tendon at the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The bellies of the flexors extend down the forearm, becoming thin tendons roughly 2 inches proximal to the wrist. And if you look at that diagram, if you find the wrist about 2 inches up, and if you look at your own wrist, you can really see, I don't know if you guys can see on me, especially, I wonder if it won't let me really adjust the lighting there, but you can see, especially on me, about 2 inches up, right in there, those tendons. So if you look at that picture, the way they come down into the hand and attach. So we're going to kind of break those down one by one. There aren't any highlights there. We have our flexor carpi radialis. It flexes the wrist and abducts the wrist, may assist with flexion of the elbow, because we did learn that it is up there on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So even though it is not an elbow flexor, it may assist with flexion at the elbow. Its origin is the common flexor tendon of the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and it inserts the bases of 2nd through 3rd metacarpals. So 2nd through 3rd metacarpals right down here on my little bone guy here. Palmaris longus action. It helps to tense the palmar fascia right here in the hand, flex the wrist, and may assist in flexion of the elbow, just like the carpi radialis. It is at that flexor tendon of the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and it inserts in the retinaculum of the palmar aponeurosis. You can kind of see from the pictures there, that palmar aponeurosis there coming down. Aponeurosis, flat tendinous sheath. And then on page 142, our flexor carpi ulnaris actions. Again, no highlights here, but it flexes the wrist. So flexion. I wish I could have this where we could see me doing anatomic movements. It adducts the wrist, abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction, and assists flexion of the elbow, again, because it is up there on that humeral head, and comes, and also on the proximal 2/3 of the ulna. So you can see its origin is both on humerus and ulna. Kind of fans out down and along the ulna, 2/3 of it, if you can see, quite a bit of the ulna that it comes, fans down off of, and inserts at the pisiform, hook of the hamate, and base of the 5th metacarpal. So that hook of the hamate, as we talked about before, right in here. Can you get where you can see that little hook right there? All right, and right behind that was the pisiform. We have our flexor digitorum superficialis, which is also flexing 2nd through 5th fingers. And flex the wrist at the radiocarpal joint. And then we have our digitorum profundus, which is flex 2nd through 5th fingers as well, assisting in flexing the wrist. And that's about it. When do we use those flexors? Squeezing the hand strap of a fast-moving train. Think about that next time you're on a train. Turning on a water valve, holding a cell phone. The palmaris longus, palming a large grapefruit, doing fingertip push-ups. I don't know what that is. Making a snowball. Flexor carpi ulnaris, using your hand to brush food off a kitchen table, unscrewing a tight lid on a jar, or delivering an incredible judo chop. All right, so let's go over to page 146. And we are now going to look at pronator teres. Located on the anterior surface of the forearm, the round pronator teres is tucked between the brachioradialis and forearm flexors. It is partially superficial and the only muscle in this vicinity with oblique fibers. So you can see when you look at that diagram 3.99 how those fibers run obliquely. The pronator teres is an antagonist to the biceps brachii. And if you remember, antagonist means opposite movement. So whatever the biceps brachii does, the pronator teres is going to do the opposite or assist in doing the opposite. Carrying a bowl of soup, muscles, and creates pronation of the forearm. The pronation antagonist of the biceps. Carrying a bowl of soup. It's kind of what I was talking about, supination, pronation. The distal tendon of the biceps brachii, situated just lateral to the pronator teres, is a good landmark for locating its fiber. So distal tendon of biceps brachii coming down here and situated just lateral of the pronator teres. Then you do some rotation. You can kind of feel it pop in and do that action for you. Its origin, actually let's do its actions. Pronate the forearm, assist to flex the elbow. So pronation and assist to flex the elbow. And remember, pronation here is happening in that joint of the radial ulnar joint there, where it's allowed to articulate and move. Common flexor tendon from medial epicondyle of humerus and coronoid process of the ulna is its origin, and it inserts to the middle or of lateral surface of the radius. So middle of lateral surface of the radius. We've got our nice little bump right there. Remember, blue is insertion, red is origin when you look at our anatomic skeletons here in class. Or if you're in Fort Myers, hopefully you guys have those there too. When do we use our pronator? Turning a doorknob, arranging cups in the dishwasher, swimming the breaststroke. When you're swimming the breaststroke, you're doing a lot of pronation. All right, so then we have pronator quadratus, and right there should let you know the shape of it, etc. Although it lacks the pronator teres power and speed, the small quadratus muscle is still a capable pronator. It has transverse fibers that lie deep to the flexor tendons and the major nerve and blood vessels of the anterior forearm. The majority of the muscle is inaccessible except for its most lateral portion. So most lateral portion is going to be right out here. Its action is pronate the forearm, and its origin, as we talked about, medial anterior surface of the distal ulna, so that lower part of the ulna, and its insertion lateral anterior surface of the distal radius. We have our supinator, which is located on the lateral side of the elbow. The short supinator is deep to the forearm extensors and superficial to the head of the radius. As its name suggests, it supinates the forearm and is an antagonist to the pronator teres. So those muscles kind of help us out by saying that they're pronators or supinators, right? That give us the action. So they can help assist to flex, but their primary purpose is pronation or supination. We're not going to really go too deep into the muscles of the thumb and hand. I do want you to go ahead and turn to page 149, where we have a diagram of the muscles of the thumb and hand. You can see them all coming down. You can see those tendons we were talking about earlier. You can see like flexor pollicis longus and digitorum, where they come down and insert onto the phalanges. You can see the retinaculum. It's a really good view to kind of see how everything wraps in and under, and you could see how it would be really easy to get some kind of impingement happening in our wrist, and why we really need that, not only the forearm, but the wrist, the ham, that thenar eminence there on the thumb, all the way down the fingers. When I'm massaging, I always give good pulls on the fingers. I always work around the edges and the top and bottom. A lot of people just tend to massage the palmar side. Really should massage all in and around those metacarpals here, down along the tops and bottoms of the phalanges, and giving those little pulls too, all the way down. What I usually like to tell the students, I'm squeezing the toothpaste, but really I'm just getting some good blood flow all the way through those muscles. If somebody is a massage therapist, Cosmo, sits at a desk with their hand gripped on a mouse, baseball player, anybody that's using the hand and wrist quite a bit in their trade or their career, don't gloss over or overlook massaging fingers, both sides, palmar and dorsal part of the hand, and all around, doing some isolation. I always kind of go in and do some isolation for those carpals, some very gentle stretches. The only time you want to be careful there is knowing whether or not somebody, and you usually can tell right away, has any hypermobility in their joints, but you can kind of get in there and really do some good releasing through those carpals, metacarpals. You can even come in and do some stretch movement through the hand, where you're actually taking the different metacarpals and trying to get some movement back in them when they get bound up. Like, it's hard for me to demonstrate that on myself. Let me see if I think I have a little hand over here. It's not a massage hand. It's kind of a creepy Cosmo hand, but you can actually grab and do some isolation and trying to move and separate those metacarpals to get some movement back in there if it gets really stiff and tight. So in the little box on the left side of the page, on page 149, I want you to highlight the 8 muscles that move the thumb. 8 muscles just for the thumb. Remember, opposable thumbs say what? The 8 muscles that move the thumb can be divided into 2 groups: short and long muscles. The 4 short muscles are located at the thenar eminence, right in here. Good imblex word. That is the fleshy mass at the base of the thumb, right in here. And in palm reading, they call it the mound of Venus. In massage, we call it the thenar eminence, right in this area. So that's 4. That's where the 4 short muscles of the 8 that move the thumb around in all the different directions that it can go. And if you flip over to page 150, you can see a lot of those muscles in the hand that come from those metacarpals and carpals out to the phalanges. I don't think we're going to go through all of them. It's 3:09. We have some time. It can just, we don't have any highlights here. I'll kind of go just briefly over them and some of their actions. So these are the long muscles of the thumb. We have the abductor pollicis longus. So remember, pollicis, thumb, thumbs up at the poles, right? So the long muscles, extensor pollicis longus, abductor pollicis longus abducts the thumb, extends the thumb, abducts the wrist. Extensor pollicis longus and brevis extend the thumb through the interphalangeal joint, extend the thumb through the metacarpophalangeal joint and carpometacarpal joints, and abduct the wrist. Then we have the flexor pollicis longus, which flexes the thumb at the interphalangeal joint, right in there between the phalanges, right? And flex the thumb at the metacarpophalangeal and carpometacarpal joints. Assist to flex the wrist. When do we use them? Typing, gaming, and texting, painting with a small brush, throwing a ball, holding a pencil when writing, grasping the handle of a teacup, unlocking a door with a key, making a fist, giving a thumbs up gesture, hitchhiking, I like A-OK, and of course, milking a goat, never have I ever. So then we have the short muscles of the thumb. Abductor, abductor pollicis brevis. Remember, brevis is short. It abducts the thumb and assists in opposition of the thumb. The flexor pollicis brevis flexes the thumb and assists in opposition of the thumb as well. Apponens pollicis, which is opposition of the thumb, and adductor pollicis, which is a deduction. And that is that thenar eminence right in here where those short muscles lie. If you look at the diagrams, you can see they all kind of come out through that area of the thenar eminence. No highlights here, you guys. If you come over to page 157, we have the lumbricals and interoci. And the lumbricals sprout from the sides of the flexor digitorum profundus tendons on the palmar side of the hand. Deep to the lumbricals, the palmar interoci are located between the metacarpals. And you can see in that diagram where they lie in between. Again, like I said, massaging in between all of those metacarpals, both dorsal and palmar side of the hand. I don't know if there's too much more in here really to lecture on. It's a nice area to explore. I do want you to come over to page 162. I was talking about this earlier. The ulnar nerve. Funny bone, you guys. The ulnar nerve passes between the medial epicondyle and olecranon process as it extends down the forearm. So we're coming into that medial epicondyle and olecranon process. So right in here, and if we look at Mr. Bones, right in here, right in this space, right in here. almost dropped my book. All right, so between the medial epicondyle and olecranon process as it extends down the forearm. So if you have an impingement, that's when you start to get the tingling in these three fingers. You want to be careful if you're working around that elbow a little bit because you don't want to accidentally trigger the funny bone because it's not so funny. So between these two landmarks, the nerve is superficial and easily accessible. Hence, bumping your elbow can irritate the ulnar nerve and create that annoying funny bone sensation that shoots down your arm. And we call it the olecranon process, but as I mentioned, some of my students started calling it the olecranon process. And it became this kind of joke in class. If somebody bumped their funny bone, we'd always know because you'd hear somebody somewhere in the room say, ole, and we knew they hit their funny bone. So it's a good way to remember that olecranon process. Right between that and that medial epicondyle is where that ulnar nerve passes. So be careful if you're trying to work on any tennis elbow and or the muscles around that area that you don't trigger it because people will not be happy with ya. You look at the bottom of the page, here is that interosseous membrane I was talking about. The bottom of page 162, if you look at the diagram, it's kind of the fascia. It's technically a membrane right in this area between ulna and radius, right through here. That interosseous membrane is a thin but strong fibrous sheath that binds together the forearm bones and serves as an attachment site for several muscles. So sometimes muscle can attach to a membrane, an aponeurosis, to another tendon of another muscle. Sometimes several muscles will come together into one tendon. A good example is Achilles tendon of the calcaneus tendon is what we know it as medically. The soleus and gastroc, and I think plantaris, I think also inserts in there. So the interosseous membrane is an attachment site for several muscles. Its oblique cord strengthens the membrane's proximal end, so proximal closer to the elbow. And you can see that oblique cord coming up and around. During stress, it is not common for the bones to fracture before the interosseous membrane tears. We know a membrane tear can take longer than a tendon tear. So probably a good thing that does not tear for us. Because of its deep location, the membrane is not directly accessible. Exploration between the bones at the distal half of the forearm, however, can give you a sense of its presence and its tensile firmness. So if you try to come down in this distal end and press in between the two bones here as they come towards the carpals, you can kind of feel how tense it is down in that area. It's very strong. You can see on pages 164 and 165 the tendons, the retinaculum. And other than that, I don't really have anything else to lecture. That was quite a bit, but it's definitely a shorter section than the arm and shoulder. We went over the diagrams. I went through the only highlights for that section that were important to us. We kind of had a short lecture today. Are there any questions at all? I know that some of you are only just making up hours or reviewing, but please feel free if you have questions at any time. If you are watching this after the fact, no questions, all right, thanks. If you are watching this after the fact, uploaded to MindTap, and you do have questions, you can always text. It's up written behind me, it's hard to tell, L Polgreen, LPOLLGREEN at sunstate.edu with any questions that you have, and that way I can reply. Maybe I said something too quickly, or I know it's hard to read with the shadows, what is typed on the board there behind me, or the glare. Maybe if I move, it makes it a little less glared there. But please feel free to let me know if and when you have any questions, email me, etc. And Other than that, if there's nothing else, then we'll wrap this part of it up. The rest of it should already be opened up. I think we split it into half. If not, I will open up the rest of this module to be worked on. The remainder of the trail guide slides, I'm going to go in and open those up, as well as the test diagrams and the Kahoot. If I think there's a Kahoot, I'll double check. And then the exam itself, the exam does have those diagrams on there. I think it's 7 of them for arm and shoulder. 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 diagrams will be on there in a drop-down menu format. And other than that, we're done. I'm going to do some abduction and adduction, some flexion and extension, fingers and wrist, and wave goodbye. Have a great day, you guys.